Picture this. You wake up in the morning, pull back your curtains, and instead of seeing blue skies and puffy white clouds, you're greeted by a rusty orange horizon, stretching endlessly in every direction. The sun hangs smaller and dimmer in a butterscotch sky, and there's not a single bird, tree, or blade of grass anywhere to be seen. This isn't some post-apocalyptic nightmare. This is Tuesday morning on Mars, and somehow, impossibly, humans have made this alien world their home. Now I know what you're thinking. Mars, really? That cold, barren rock floating 140 million miles away from everything we know and love? But here's the thing that might surprise you. Right now, as you're listening to this, some of the brightest minds on our planet are working around the clock to make human life on Mars not just possible, but inevitable. SpaceX is planning to launch 5 uncrewed starships to Mars in 2026. NASA has committed to landing humans on the red planet sometime in the 2030s. And Elon Musk, well, he's talking about 1 million people living on Mars by 2050. But before we get carried away with the romantic notion of becoming interplanetary explorers, we need to ask ourselves a rather important question. What would it actually be like to live on Mars? Not just visit for a few weeks or months, but truly live there. Wake up there every morning, raise children there, grow old there, and eventually be buried in that alien soil. Because here's what I've discovered after diving deep into the latest research, talking to planetary scientists, and examining data from every Mars mission we've ever launched. Living on Mars wouldn't just be different from life on Earth. It would be so fundamentally, almost impossibly challenging that it would reshape everything we think we know about what it means to be human. So settle in, because we're about to take a journey to a world where a single breath of unfiltered air would kill you in seconds, where the radiation exposure from just walking outside could give you cancer, and where the very act of having a baby might be biologically impossible. But we're also going to explore a world where humans might develop incredible new technologies, create entirely new forms of society, and perhaps even evolve into something beyond what we are today. Before we dive in, if you're new here, welcome to The Weary Researcher, and if you're back for another video, welcome back. Either way, I would greatly appreciate it if you could hit that like and subscribe button. It truly helps the channel. Now back to the video. This is the story of what would happen if humans didn't just visit Mars, but made it our second home. And I promise you, it's stranger, more dangerous, and more fascinating than any science fiction movie you've ever seen. Let's start with the journey itself, because getting to Mars isn't like hopping on a flight to another continent. We're talking about a voyage that would make the most ambitious sea expeditions in human history look like a leisurely afternoon cruise. The trip to Mars takes anywhere from 80 to 150 days, depending on the alignment of the planets. That's roughly 4 to 5 months trapped in a metal tube, hurtling through the vacuum of space with the same group of people, breathing recycled air, drinking recycled water, and eating food that was packaged months or even years ago. But here's the really unsettling part. Once you arrive on Mars, you can't just turn around and come home. The planets only align properly for return trips every 26 months. So your minimum commitment to this new world isn't a few weeks or months. It's nearly 3 years. Think about that for a moment. 3 years minimum, with no possibility of rescue, no possibility of evacuation, and no possibility of simply changing your mind and heading home when things get difficult. And trust me, things would get difficult in ways that would challenge every survival instinct humans have developed over millions of years of evolution. The moment you step out of your spacecraft onto the Martian surface, you'd be entering an environment so hostile to human life that it makes the most extreme places on Earth look like tropical vacation resorts. The atmospheric pressure on Mars is less than 1% of what we experience on Earth. To put that in perspective, you'd have to climb to an altitude of about 28 miles above Earth's surface to experience similar pressure. That's well into the stratosphere, where even the most advanced fighter jets can barely operate. What this means in practical terms is that without a pressure suit, your blood would literally begin to boil, not from heat, but from the lack of atmospheric pressure. This isn't science fiction. This is basic physics. Water boils at lower temperatures when pressure decreases, and since your body's roughly 60% water, you can imagine how that story ends. But let's say you've got a proper pressure suit and life support system. You're protected from the immediate threat of explosive decompression. Now you get to deal with the temperature. Mars is cold, not just winter in Alaska cold, but so cold that the average temperature across the entire planet is minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's not just consistently cold. The temperature swings on Mars are absolutely brutal. You could experience a pleasant 70 degrees Fahrenheit at your feet while standing on the equator at noon, but your head would be experiencing temperatures closer to freezing. The atmosphere is so thin that heat from the sun escapes almost immediately, creating these wild temperature gradients that would make designing clothing and shelter incredibly challenging. And then there's the air itself. What little atmosphere Mars has is 95% carbon dioxide. There's virtually no oxygen, no nitrogen that you can breathe, and certainly no protection from the cosmic radiation that's constantly bombarding the surface. Every single breath you take on Mars would have to come from a life support system. Every single breath for the rest of your life. But here's where things get really interesting and really disturbing. The radiation exposure on Mars isn't just a minor health concern, it's a constant, invisible threat that would fundamentally alter how humans could live, work, and reproduce on the planet. An astronaut traveling to Mars would be exposed to radiation levels up to 700 times higher than what we experience on Earth. To put that in perspective, spending just one day in space exposes you to the same amount of radiation you'd normally receive in an entire year on Earth. And once you're on Mars, the radiation doesn't stop. The planet has no magnetic field to protect it from cosmic rays and solar radiation, so you're constantly being bombarded by high-energy particles that can damage your DNA, increase your risk of cancer, and cause a whole host of other health problems. We're talking about radiation levels that are 2.5 times higher than what astronauts experience on the International Space Station. That works out to about 8,000 millirads per year, which is more than 4 times the maximum annual dose considered safe for radiation workers on Earth. And this isn't just about cancer risk, although that's certainly a major concern. This level of radiation exposure can cause cataracts, cardiovascular disease, damage to the central nervous system, disrupted sleep patterns, fertility problems, and even changes in hand-eye coordination. Now imagine trying to build a civilization under these conditions. Every structure would need to provide radiation shielding. Every vehicle would need to be a miniature fortress against cosmic rays. And anytime someone needed to work outside, they'd be literally risking their life with every hour of exposure. But perhaps the most profound challenge facing humans on Mars would be something we take completely for granted here on Earth: gravity. Mars has only 38% of Earth's gravitational pull, and while that might sound like fun at first, the long-term effects on the human body would be devastating. We know from studying astronauts who spend extended periods in space that the human body starts breaking down without proper gravity. Bones lose density at a rate of about 1% per month, muscles atrophy. The cardiovascular system weakens. And these effects might be even more pronounced on Mars because you'd be dealing with partial gravity for years or decades, not just the few months that astronauts typically spend in zero gravity. Think about what this means for children born on Mars. They would develop in an environment with fundamentally different physical stresses than humans have ever experienced. Their bones might be weaker, their muscles less developed, their cardiovascular systems adapted to a world with less gravitational pull. In essence, they might be physiologically unable to ever visit Earth, the planet their parents came from. This raises profound questions about what it would mean to be human in a multi-planetary species. Would Martians eventually become a separate branch of humanity, adapted to their world, but forever cut off from ours. But let's assume that humans could somehow overcome or adapt to these physical challenges. Let's imagine that we develop technology and medical treatments that allow us to survive and even thrive in Mars' hostile environment. What would daily life actually look like on this alien world? First, you'd never, ever go outside without a full environmental suit. Never. Not even for 30 seconds to grab something you left on your doorstep. The Martian environment is so immediately lethal that exposure to it would kill you faster than jumping into the Arctic Ocean without a wetsuit. Every trip outside would require careful planning, backup life support systems, and constant monitoring of your suit's integrity. Your home would be less like a house and more like a submarine or space station. It would need to maintain constant air pressure, temperature control, radiation shielding, and air recycling systems. Every room would essentially be a small life support capsule, and connecting different areas of your home might require going through airlocks to maintain atmospheric integrity. The food you eat would either come from incredibly sophisticated indoor growing systems or be shipped from Earth at enormous expense. There are no farms on Mars, no hunting, no fishing, no popping down to the local farmer's market for fresh vegetables. Everything would need to be carefully planned, rationed, and recycled. Scientists have identified a few plants that might be suitable for Mars cultivation, like duckweed and water ferns, but these would need to grow in controlled environments, with artificial atmosphere, carefully managed nutrients, and protection from radiation. Water would be precious beyond anything we can imagine on Earth. While there is water on Mars, mostly in the form of underground ice, extracting and purifying it would require significant energy and technology. Every drop would need to be recycled, purified, and carefully managed. Taking a long shower or filling a swimming pool would be literally unthinkable luxuries. And then there's the psychological challenge of living in such an isolated, controlled environment. Imagine never seeing a natural landscape that wasn't rust-coloured and barren. Never feeling rain on your skin or breathing fresh air. Never seeing a bird, a tree, an ocean, or a cloud that wasn't artificially created. The psychological impact of such complete isolation from the natural world would be unprecedented in human history. The people who would thrive in this environment would need to be incredibly psychologically resilient, highly trained in multiple technical skills, and capable of working in small groups under extreme stress for extended periods. They would need to be part engineer, part scientist, part psychologist, and part survivor. But here's what's truly fascinating. Despite all these challenges, humans are already developing the technology and strategies that could make life on Mars possible. NASA's MOXIE experiment has successfully produced oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. Engineers are designing 3D printers that could use Martian soil to build habitats. Scientists are developing closed-loop life support systems that could recycle air, water, and waste with incredible efficiency. The question isn't really whether humans could survive on Mars. With enough technology, planning, and resources, we probably could. The real question is what we would become in the process. Would we still be the same species that evolved on Earth, or would we become something new, something adapted to life among the stars? And that's just the beginning of this incredible story. We haven't even talked about what it would take to build actual cities on Mars, how we might terraform the planet to make it more Earth-like, or what would happen to human society and culture when it's spread across multiple worlds. Because the truth is, if humans do eventually establish permanent settlements on Mars, it won't just change life on the red planet. It will fundamentally transform what it means to be human, period. So let's dive deeper into what building a functioning society on Mars would actually look like, because the challenges go far beyond just keeping individual humans alive. We're talking about creating an entirely new branch of human civilization on a world that actively wants to kill everything we bring to it. The first settlements on Mars wouldn't be cities in any sense that we'd recognise. They'd be more like extremely sophisticated survival bunkers connected by pressurised tunnels. Picture a network of underground or heavily shielded structures, each one a self-contained life support system, linked together like pearls on a string beneath the Martian surface. Every connection point would need multiple backup systems because a single failure could cut off entire sections of the colony from air, water or power. The engineering challenges of building these habitats are staggering. Every structure would need to withstand massive daily temperature swings, protection from radiation that could penetrate several feet of solid rock, and the constant threat of dust storms that can last for months and cover the entire planet. Martian dust isn't like Earth dust either. It's incredibly fine, gets into everything, and carries an electrostatic charge that makes it cling to surfaces like it's been glued there. It would wear down equipment, clog filters, and potentially cause serious health problems if inhaled. But here's where human ingenuity starts to shine through. Engineers are already designing robots that could be sent to Mars years before the first humans arrive. These machines would use Martian soil, called regolith, to 3D print the basic structures of habitats. They dig down into the ground for radiation protection, mine local materials for construction, and even begin producing oxygen and water before the first colonists ever set foot on the planet. The most successful Mars habitats would likely be built like layered fortresses. The outer shell would provide radiation shielding and structural integrity. Inside that, you'd have multiple atmospheric zones, each one capable of sustaining life independently if the others failed. The innermost areas would house the most critical systems and serve as emergency shelters if everything else went wrong. Now let's talk about the economy of Mars, because someone has to pay for all this incredible technology and infrastructure. The first Mars colonies would be entirely dependent on Earth for decades, maybe centuries. Every spare part, every piece of advanced technology, every luxury item would need to be shipped across millions of miles of space at costs that would make shipping a package overnight look like pocket change. But here's where things get interesting. Mars has resources that could eventually make it incredibly valuable to Earth. The planet contains significant deposits of deuterium, a heavy isotope of hydrogen that's essential for fusion reactors. On Earth, deuterium sells for about $10,000 per kilogram, roughly 50 times more valuable than silver. Mars has about 5 times more deuterium than Earth, making it potentially one of the most valuable resources in the solar system. There's also the matter of manufacturing in low gravity and thin atmosphere. Certain industrial processes that are difficult or impossible on Earth might be much easier on Mars. Crystal growth, metal alloys, pharmaceutical production, all of these could potentially be done more efficiently in Mars's unique environment. Eventually, Mars might not just be a destination for colonists, but a manufacturing hub for the entire solar system. The question of governance on Mars opens up fascinating possibilities that could reshape human political systems entirely. Who would make the laws on Mars? What happens when the communication delay between Earth and Mars reaches 22 minutes each way, making real-time consultation impossible? Would Mars develop its own government, its own currency, its own legal system? Early Mars colonies would probably operate more like research stations or military outposts, with strict hierarchies and carefully planned resource allocation. But as populations grow and become more permanent, you'd start to see the emergence of genuinely new forms of human society. When every breath of air and drop of water has to be carefully managed and recycled, concepts like private property and individual consumption take on completely different meanings. Imagine a society where wasting water isn't just inconsiderate, it's potentially fatal to your neighbours. Where energy consumption isn't just an environmental concern, but a direct threat to community survival. Where every decision about resource allocation could mean the difference between the colony thriving or everyone dying slowly as their life support systems fail. This kind of environment would likely produce humans who think very differently about community, responsibility, and the relationship between individual desires and group survival. Martian society might develop entirely new philosophies, new religions, new ways of organizing human relationships that we can't even imagine from our perspective on resource-abundant Earth. And then there's the question of reproduction and child-rearing on Mars. We honestly don't know if human reproduction would even be possible in Mars's low gravity and high radiation environment. Animal studies suggest that development in reduced gravity could cause serious problems with bone formation, muscle development, and organ function. The radiation exposure alone might make pregnancy incredibly dangerous for both mother and child. If humans could successfully reproduce on Mars, those children would face unique challenges. They'd grow up in a world where they could never go outside without life support, where every natural instinct about fresh air and open spaces would be not just useless, but potentially fatal. They'd develop in low gravity, potentially making them unable to ever visit Earth. They might be the first generation of humans who are truly permanently adapted to life on another world. The psychological implications are staggering. These children would have no direct experience of Earth's blue skies, oceans, forests, or wildlife. Their understanding of nature would be entirely artificial, filtered through life support systems and carefully controlled environments. They might develop fundamentally different relationships with technology, with community, and with the natural world than any humans before them. Education on Mars would need to be completely reimagined. Children would need to learn not just traditional subjects, but complex life support systems, emergency procedures, resource management, and skills that don't even exist on Earth. They'd need to understand that their survival depends on technology that requires constant maintenance and expertise. But perhaps most intriguingly, they might also develop capabilities that Earth humans don't have. Growing up in low gravity might give them abilities to move and work in three-dimensional spaces that would be impossible for Earth-born humans. They might develop better spatial reasoning, different approaches to problem-solving, and ways of thinking about physics and engineering that take advantage of their unique environment. The cultural implications are equally fascinating. What kind of art would emerge from a world with butterscotch skies and no organic life? What music would develop in enclosed spaces where every sound is artificially created? What stories would people tell when the traditional human relationship with nature has been completely severed? Mars colonists might develop entirely new forms of entertainment, new sports adapted to low gravity, new social customs built around the realities of life support and resource sharing. They might create art forms that we can't imagine, philosophies that address questions Earth humans have never had to consider, and cultural practices that reflect the unique challenges and opportunities of life on an alien world. The technological development required to sustain human life on Mars would likely accelerate innovation in ways that would benefit both worlds. Closed-loop life support systems, radiation shielding, efficient food production, advanced manufacturing techniques, all of these technologies developed for Mars could revolutionize life on Earth as well. But there's a darker possibility we need to consider. What if the challenges of Mars are so extreme that they fundamentally change human nature itself? What if the constant pressure of survival, the complete dependence on technology, and the isolation from Earth's natural environment create humans who think and behave in ways that would be unrecognizable to us? The people who thrive on Mars might need to be so focused on technical skills, so adapted to controlled environments, and so accustomed to following strict protocols that they lose some of the creativity, spontaneity, and emotional range that we consider essentially human. they might become incredibly efficient at survival, but less capable of the kind of abstract thinking, artistic expression, and emotional depth that define human culture on Earth. Or they might go in completely the opposite direction. Freed from many of Earth's constraints, exposed to entirely new challenges and possibilities, they might develop forms of creativity and intelligence that surpass anything we've achieved on our home planet. The question is whether they'd still be recognizably human when they got there. The timeline for all of this is still highly uncertain. Optimistic projections suggest the first permanent Mars settlements could be established by the 2040s, but most experts believe it will take much longer to build truly self-sustaining colonies. We're talking about a process that could take centuries, with multiple generations of humans dedicating their entire lives to making this alien world habitable. And that raises the ultimate question about human life on Mars. Would it be worth it? Would the incredible cost, risk, and sacrifice required to establish permanent human settlements on Mars justify the potential benefits? Or would we be better off focusing our resources on solving the challenges we face here on Earth? The answer might depend on what we discover about Mars as we learn more about it. Recent data suggests that liquid water might exist deep underground on Mars, potentially harboring life forms that evolved independently from Earth. If that's true, Mars might not be the barren, lifeless world we've assumed. It might be an entire biosphere waiting to be discovered, with implications that would reshape our understanding of life in the universe. But even if Mars turns out to be completely lifeless, the attempt to establish human civilization there would push our species to develop technologies, social systems, and ways of thinking that could benefit all of humanity. The challenges of Mars might force us to solve problems of resource management, environmental control, and social cooperation that we desperately need to address here on Earth as well. The story of humans on Mars isn't just about colonizing another planet, it's about what our species might become when we're forced to transcend the limitations of a single world. And that transformation, for better or worse, might be the most significant development in human history since we first learned to control fire. But we're still just scratching the surface of this incredible possibility. The real question isn't just whether humans could survive on Mars, but whether we could transform Mars itself into a world more suitable for human life. And that brings us to one of the most ambitious and controversial ideas in all of science: terraforming. The word terraforming sounds like something straight out of a science fiction novel, but it's actually a serious scientific concept that researchers around the world are studying with the kind of intensity usually reserved for curing diseases or solving climate change. The basic idea is simple enough to explain to a child: take a planet that's hostile to human life and gradually transform it into something more Earth-like. The reality, however, is so mind-bogglingly complex that it makes landing humans on Mars look like a leisurely weekend project. Let's start with what terraforming Mars would actually require, because the challenges are so immense they almost defy comprehension. You'd need to thicken the atmosphere, warm the planet, create a magnetic field to protect from radiation, establish a water cycle, and somehow introduce an entire ecosystem of plants and animals that could survive in an environment that spent billions of years perfecting the art of killing anything that dares to live on its surface. The atmosphere problem alone is staggering. Mars lost most of its atmosphere billions of years ago, and what's left is so thin that even if we could capture every molecule of carbon dioxide on the entire planet and pump it back into the air, we'd still only achieve about 10 to 14% of Earth's atmospheric pressure. That's not nearly enough to support liquid water on the surface, let alone human life without pressure suits. But here's where things get really interesting. Scientists have recently proposed some absolutely wild solutions that sound like they came from the mind of a mad genius. One idea involves injecting millions of tons of specially designed particles into Mars's atmosphere every year. These particles would act like tiny mirrors, trapping heat and warming the planet by more than 10 degrees Celsius in just a few months. That might not sound like much, but it could be enough to start melting the polar ice caps and begin creating a thicker atmosphere. Another proposal involves placing a massive magnetic shield at the point between Mars and the Sun, where gravitational forces balance out. This shield would protect Mars from the solar wind that's constantly stripping away its atmosphere, essentially giving the planet a chance to rebuild what it's been losing for eons. It's the kind of engineering project that would make building the pyramids look like stacking blocks. But it's theoretically possible with technology we could develop in the next century. The temperature challenge is equally daunting. Mars receives only about half the sunlight that Earth does, and its thin atmosphere means that what little heat it gets immediately radiates back into space. Even if we could thicken the atmosphere significantly, we'd still need to find ways to trap and distribute heat across the planet. Some scientists have proposed covering parts of Mars with dark materials that would absorb more sunlight, while others suggest releasing greenhouse gases that are thousands of times more effective than carbon dioxide at trapping heat. But let's say we somehow solve the atmosphere and temperature problems. We'd still need to create an entire ecosystem from scratch on a planet that has no organic soil, no existing plant life, and no natural cycles of nutrients that Earth-based life depends on. We'd essentially need to terraform not just the atmosphere and climate, but the very biological foundation that makes complex life possible. This is where terraforming moves from engineering challenge into something approaching biological alchemy. You'd need to introduce bacteria that could survive in Martian conditions and begin breaking down rock into soil, then hardy plants that could grow in that soil while gradually adding oxygen to the atmosphere, then insects and small animals that could pollinate plants and create food webs. Eventually, you might work your way up to larger animals and more complex ecosystems. The timeline for this process would be measured not in decades or centuries, but in millennia. We're talking about a project that would span hundreds of generations of human civilization. The people who started terraforming Mars would never see the results, nor would their children, grandchildren, or great-great-grandchildren. It would be the ultimate, long-term investment in humanity's future, and that raises profound questions about human nature and our ability to commit to projects that extend far beyond our own lifespans. On Earth, we struggle to address climate change that will affect our children and grandchildren. Could we really commit to a terraforming project that wouldn't show major results for 1,000 years or more? There's also the ethical dimension that most people don't consider when they fantasize about terraforming Mars. What if Mars isn't actually lifeless? Recent discoveries suggest that microbial life might exist deep underground on Mars, evolved over billions of years to survive in conditions that would kill Earth life instantly. If we terraform Mars, we might be committing genocide against an entire branch of life that took a completely different evolutionary path than anything on Earth. These Martian microbes, if they exist, could hold keys to understanding how life develops under extreme conditions, how it might exist on other planets throughout the universe, and possibly even how life on Earth got started in the first place. Terraforming could destroy this irreplaceable scientific treasure before we even know it exists. But let's assume for a moment that we decide terraforming is worth the risks and costs. What would the process actually look like to the humans living through it? The first few centuries would be incredibly dangerous and uncertain. You'd be living on a planet that's actively being transformed by technologies that have never been tested on such a massive scale. The atmosphere would be changing, the climate would be shifting, and nobody would really know if the whole project might suddenly fail catastrophically. Imagine trying to plan a city when you don't know if the air pressure next century will support the buildings you're constructing today. Imagine trying to establish agriculture when the atmospheric composition is deliberately being altered and might make your crops impossible to grow. Every aspect of life would be affected by the uncertainty of living through an unprecedented planetary transformation. The humans who lived through terraforming would need to be incredibly adaptable, both technologically and psychologically. They'd need to accept that nothing about their environment was permanent or predictable. Their children might grow up breathing different air than they did. Their grandchildren might live in a world with weather patterns that didn't exist when the colony was founded. This kind of constant environmental flux would likely produce humans who think very differently about permanence, planning, and the relationship between technology and nature. They might develop a much more fluid, adaptive approach to civilization than Earth humans have ever needed, or they might become so focused on controlling and monitoring their environment that they lose the ability to appreciate natural processes and unexpected changes. But here's the truly mind-bending possibility. What if terraforming Mars doesn't just change the planet, but fundamentally alters the humans doing the terraforming? The process would require levels of long-term thinking, technological integration, and environmental management that no human society has ever achieved. The people capable of successfully terraforming a planet might need to develop cognitive abilities, social structures, and ways of relating to their environment that would make them as different from us as we are from our hunter-gatherer ancestors. They might need to think in geological timescales, plan projects that span millennia, and maintain technologies so complex that no individual human could understand all of them. They might need to develop forms of collective intelligence, enhanced memory systems, and decision-making processes that extend far beyond the capabilities of individual human brains. In essence, terraforming Mars might not just create a second Earth, it might create a second form of humanity, one adapted not just to life on Mars, but to the godlike task of reshaping entire worlds to suit their needs. The economic implications of terraforming are equally staggering. We're talking about the most expensive project in human history, requiring resources and coordination on a scale that would dwarf every government budget and corporate investment combined. The initial costs would be so enormous that they could only be justified if the long-term benefits were truly transformational for all of humanity. But those benefits might indeed be transformational. A successfully terraformed Mars would essentially double the amount of habitable space available to human civilization. It would provide a backup location for human culture and knowledge in case of catastrophic events on Earth, and the technologies developed during terraforming would likely revolutionize our ability to manage and repair Earth's own environmental challenges. More intriguingly, terraforming Mars might be just the beginning. Once we've proven that it's possible to transform one planet, we might set our sights on Venus, the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, or even more distant worlds. Humanity could become not just a multiplanetary species, but a truly galactic civilization, spreading life throughout the cosmos by transforming dead worlds into gardens. The cultural and spiritual implications of terraforming are perhaps the most profound of all. For the first time in human history, we would be taking on a role that we've traditionally attributed only to gods or natural forces, the creation of entire worlds suitable for life. This would fundamentally change how we see ourselves in relation to nature, technology, and the universe itself. We would no longer be a species that adapts to environments, but one that creates environments to suit our needs. We would be moving from being products of evolution to being directors of evolution, not just for ourselves, but for entire planetary ecosystems. The psychological and philosophical implications of this transformation are almost impossible to predict. Some humans might find this level of environmental control exhilarating, seeing it as the ultimate expression of human creativity and intelligence. Others might find it terrifying, worried that we're overstepping fundamental boundaries and taking on responsibilities that no species should have. The debates about terraforming could split human civilization along lines we can't even imagine today. But perhaps the most important question about terraforming isn't whether we could do it, but whether we should. The resources, time and energy required for terraforming Mars could potentially solve every environmental and social problem on Earth many times over. Climate change, poverty, disease, resource scarcity, all of these challenges could theoretically be addressed with a fraction of the effort that terraforming would require. This leads to what might be the most significant philosophical debate of the next few centuries. Should humanity focus on perfecting life on the planet that already supports us? Or should we expand to new worlds, even if it means accepting that Earth might never reach its full potential? The answer might depend on how we view risk and redundancy. If human civilization remains confined to Earth, then any global catastrophe, asteroid impact, supervolcanic eruption, or runaway climate change could end our species entirely. Terraforming Mars would provide insurance against existential risks, ensuring that human knowledge, culture, and creativity could survive even if Earth became uninhabitable. But insurance comes with costs, and the cost of terraforming might be so high that it actually increases the risks to human civilization by diverting resources from more immediate challenges. It's possible that the best strategy for human survival isn't expanding to new worlds, but making our existing world so resilient and well managed that catastrophic risks become negligible. The truth is, we probably won't know the right answer until we're much further along in the process of both Mars colonization and Earth environmental management. The early Mars colonies will serve as testing grounds for the technologies and social systems that terraforming would require. If those colonies thrive and develop sustainably, terraforming might become not just possible, but inevitable. If they struggle or fail, we might conclude that humanity's future lies in becoming better stewards of Earth, rather than shepherds of new worlds. But regardless of how the terraforming debate resolves, the very possibility is already changing how we think about humanity's future. We're no longer a species confined to one world, dependent on natural processes beyond our control. We're becoming something new, a species capable of creating the conditions for life itself, of transforming dead rocks into living worlds, of spreading the miracle of consciousness throughout a universe that might otherwise remain forever dark and silent. And that transformation, whether it happens on Mars or remains forever a dream, represents perhaps the most significant step in human evolution since we first learned to control fire, develop agriculture, or build cities. We're not just becoming an interplanetary species, we're becoming a species capable of creating planets themselves. The question now isn't just what humans would be like if we lived on Mars, it's what we would become if we had the power to build Mars into whatever we wanted it to be. And that answer might determine not just the future of human civilization, but the future of life itself in our corner of the universe. But even as we dream of reshaping entire worlds, we can't ignore the fact that the humans attempting these godlike feats would still be, fundamentally, human. And that means dealing with all the messy, complicated, beautiful, and tragic aspects of human nature that no amount of advanced technology can completely solve. The human drama that would unfold on Mars might be even more compelling than the technological marvels, because when you strip away the familiar comforts of Earth and place people in an environment where every mistake could be fatal, you get to see what humans are really made of. And sometimes that revelation isn't particularly flattering. Consider the psychological pressure cooker that early Mars colonies would represent. You're talking about small groups of people, maybe a few dozen to a few hundred at most, living in cramped, artificially controlled environments where privacy is virtually non-existent and personal space is measured in square feet rather than acres. Every person you work with is also your neighbour, your emergency backup, and potentially your lifeline in a crisis. There's no walking away from interpersonal conflicts, when walking away literally means walking into a vacuum that would kill you in seconds. Studies of isolated communities on Earth, from Antarctic research stations to submarine crews, give us some clues about what to expect, And frankly, the results aren't always encouraging. Even highly trained, psychologically screened professionals can develop what researchers call cabin fever after just a few months of isolation. They become irritable, paranoid, and sometimes develop serious conflicts over seemingly trivial issues. Now imagine that same dynamic playing out over years or decades, with no possibility of leaving or getting a break from the same faces, the same confined spaces, the same artificial environment. The social hierarchies that would emerge in Mars colonies could be unlike anything we've seen in human history. On Earth, leadership often comes from charisma, wealth, political connections, or inherited status. But on Mars, leadership would likely be determined by who keeps everyone alive. The person who understands the life support systems becomes more important than the person with the best communication skills. The engineer who can fix the oxygen recycler holds more real power than someone with an advanced degree in philosophy or literature. This shift could fundamentally alter human values and social structures. Skills that we prize on Earth, like artistic creativity, abstract thinking, or emotional intelligence, might become secondary to technical competence and crisis management abilities. We could see the emergence of what might be called a survival meritocracy, where your value to society is measured entirely by your ability to contribute to the colony's continued existence. But here's where it gets really interesting. Humans have a remarkable ability to adapt not just physically, but culturally and socially to extreme circumstances. The Mars colonists might develop entirely new forms of social organisation that we can't even imagine from our Earth-based perspective. They might create decision-making processes that prioritise long-term survival over individual preferences in ways that would seem authoritarian to us, but feel perfectly natural to people whose lives depend on collective responsibility. They might develop new rituals, new celebrations, new ways of marking time and meaning that reflect their unique circumstances. Imagine holidays built around successful harvests from underground growing facilities, or celebrations marking the anniversary of the first successful oxygen production, or coming-of-age ceremonies that involve mastering critical life support technologies. These wouldn't just be quaint customs. They'd be cultural adaptations to a world where community survival depends on everyone understanding and respecting the systems that keep them alive. The concept of family and child rearing would be revolutionized in ways that would challenge our most basic assumptions about human relationships. In a small, isolated colony where genetic diversity is limited and every person's contribution is critical to survival, traditional concepts of romantic partnership, marriage, and family planning would need to be completely reimagined. Colony leaders might need to make decisions about who gets to have children and when, based not on personal desires, but on genetic diversity, resource availability, and the colony's long-term survival needs. This isn't science fiction dystopia, it's practical reality when you're dealing with a founding population that might number in the hundreds rather than millions. Without careful genetic management, Mars colonies could face serious problems with inbreeding within just a few generations. The children born in these colonies would grow up with a fundamentally different relationship to risk, technology, and community than any humans before them. They'd learn from an early age that their individual survival depends absolutely on the proper functioning of incredibly complex systems and the cooperation of everyone around them. They might develop forms of social consciousness and technical literacy that would make them seem almost alien to Earth-born humans. These Mars-born children would also face unique identity challenges. They'd grow up hearing stories about Earth, a planet they might never see, with blue skies and oceans and animals that would seem as fantastical to them as dragons seem to us. Their sense of home would be tied to artificial environments and recycled air, while their genetic and cultural heritage comes from a world that might be forever beyond their reach. The language that develops in Mars colonies would likely evolve rapidly, incorporating new technical vocabulary while potentially losing words and concepts that have no relevance to their environment. Why would Mars colonists need dozens of words for different types of weather when they experience only artificial climate control? But they might develop incredibly precise vocabulary for describing the subtle sounds that indicate problems with life support systems, or the exact colours that suggest different types of equipment failure. Over generations, these linguistic changes could become so pronounced that Mars colonists and Earth humans might have difficulty understanding each other, not just culturally, but literally. We could see the emergence of distinct Martian dialects, or even entirely new languages adapted to their unique circumstances and needs. The economic systems that emerge on Mars would challenge everything we think we know about markets, property, and individual economic freedom. When air, water, and food are all artificially produced and carefully rationed, traditional concepts of personal wealth and private property become almost meaningless. You can't hoard oxygen or stockpile water when doing so could kill your neighbours. You can't pursue purely personal economic interests when everyone's survival depends on collective resource management. Mars colonies might develop economic systems that look more like sophisticated resource allocation algorithms than traditional markets. Every calorie of food, every litre of water, every kilowatt-hour of energy would need to be tracked, managed, and distributed based on complex calculations involving individual needs, community priorities, and long-term sustainability goals. This doesn't necessarily mean that Mars colonies would be communist in any traditional sense. They might develop entirely new forms of economic organisation that balance individual incentives with collective survival needs in ways we haven't seen before. Personal achievement and innovation might be rewarded not with monetary wealth, but with increased resource allocations, better living quarters, or greater influence in colony decision-making. The work that people do on Mars would be fundamentally different from most Earth occupations. There would be no entertainment industry as we know it, no luxury goods manufacturing, no purely decorative arts or frivolous services. Every job would need to contribute directly to the colony's survival and growth. People might be farmers, engineers, doctors, or scientists, but they'd all also need to be emergency responders, equipment maintenance specialists, and psychological support providers for their neighbours. This focus on essential functions could lead to humans who are incredibly competent and versatile, capable of performing multiple critical roles and adapting quickly to new challenges. But it might also produce humans who lose some of the creativity, playfulness, and diverse interests that we consider essential to human nature. When every hour of every day is potentially a matter of life and death, there's little room for the kind of purposeless exploration and experimentation that drives much of human art, literature, and scientific discovery. The legal and governance systems that emerge in Mars colonies would face unprecedented challenges. Traditional Earth legal systems assume the existence of police, courts, prisons, and other enforcement mechanisms that would be impossible to maintain in small isolated communities where everyone's continued cooperation is essential for survival. You can't exactly throw someone in jail when you need their expertise to keep the oxygen flowing. Mars colonies might develop restorative rather than punitive justice systems, focusing on rehabilitation and reintegration rather than punishment. Serious crimes that threaten community survival might result in exile, which on Mars would be equivalent to a death sentence. This stark reality would likely create strong social pressure for conformity and cooperation, but it might also stifle the kind of individual expression and dissent that drives social progress on Earth. The democratic ideals that many Earth societies value might need to be balanced against the reality that some decisions on Mars are simply too important and too technical to be made by popular vote. You can't democratically decide to ignore the laws of physics or vote to make the life support systems work differently than they actually do. This could lead to forms of technocratic governance, where technical expertise carries more weight in decision-making than popular opinion. But perhaps the most profound change would be in how Mars colonists relate to the natural world. Earth humans have always seen themselves as part of nature, even when we're trying to control or escape from it. Our languages, cultures, and spiritual systems are all built around the rhythms of natural seasons, the presence of other living creatures, and the experience of uncontrolled natural phenomena. Mars colonists would be the first humans to live entirely outside of nature, as we understand it. Their environment would be completely artificial, created and maintained by human technology. They'd have no experience of weather that isn't controlled, no interaction with other species, no connection to natural cycles that exist independently of human intervention. This could lead to forms of consciousness and spirituality that are entirely focused on human creation and technological achievement. Mars colonists might develop philosophical and religious systems that see technology not as separate from or opposed to nature, but as the highest expression of natural intelligence and creativity. They might view themselves not as separate from the universe, but as the universe's way of becoming conscious of itself and deliberately shaping its own evolution. Alternatively, they might develop a deep longing for the natural world they've never experienced, creating elaborate artificial recreations of Earth environments or developing spiritual practices focused on the distant blue dot that represents everything their species lost when they chose to leave their home world. The health and medical challenges facing Mars colonists would extend far beyond the radiation and low gravity we've already discussed. The psychological stress of constant artificial environment, the physical effects of recycled air and artificial lighting, and the limited genetic diversity of small founding populations could create health problems that we don't even know to anticipate. Mars colonies would need to become incredibly sophisticated in medical technology, not just for treating known conditions, but for dealing with entirely new health challenges that emerge from their unique environment. They might need to develop medical technologies and treatment approaches that are far more advanced than anything available on Earth, simply because they can't afford to lose anyone to preventable illness or injury. The reproductive challenges would be particularly complex. Even if humans can successfully reproduce in Mars's low gravity and high radiation environment, the children born there might be physiologically adapted to Mars in ways that make travel to Earth impossible. Over generations, Mars colonists might literally become a separate branch of humanity, as distinct from Earth humans as we are from our evolutionary ancestors. This raises profound questions about the future of human identity and unity. Would Mars-born humans consider themselves part of the same species as Earth humans? Would they feel loyalty to Earth as their ancestral home, or would they develop their own distinct identity and interests that might conflict with Earth's priorities? The communication delays between Earth and Mars would only exacerbate these potential divisions. As the planets move through their orbits, communication delays can reach up to 22 minutes each way, making real-time conversation impossible. Over time, Mars colonies would become increasingly autonomous in their decision-making, not by choice but by necessity. This communication isolation could lead to the gradual cultural and political separation of Mars from Earth, even if both populations maintain peaceful relations. Mars colonists would develop their own news, entertainment, education systems, and cultural references that have little connection to Earth experience. They might eventually view Earth humans as foreign and incomprehensible, as we might view an isolated tribe that's had no contact with modern civilization. The ultimate question facing any permanent Mars colony would be whether they're establishing a branch of human civilization or creating something entirely new that happens to be descended from humanity. The environmental pressures, social structures, economic systems, and cultural adaptations required for life on Mars are so different from anything humans have experienced that the people who thrive there might be recognizably human in their DNA, but alien in almost every other way. And this transformation wouldn't necessarily be gradual or subtle. The selection pressures for survival on Mars are so intense that significant changes could emerge within just a few generations. The humans who successfully adapt to permanent life on Mars might be as different from us as we are from medieval peasants, not because of genetic evolution, but because of the complete transformation of their environment, culture, and daily experience. This is perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of the human colonization of Mars. We're not just talking about moving our existing civilization to a new location. We're talking about the possibility that leaving Earth might be the catalyst for humanity's transformation into something beyond what we currently are. Something adapted not just to survival on alien worlds, but to the conscious creation and management of life throughout the universe. Whether this transformation represents the fulfillment of human potential or the loss of essential human qualities might be impossible to determine until long after it's already happened. And by then, the beings making that judgment might be so different from us that their conclusions would be incomprehensible to the humans who first dreamed of making Mars our home. The story of humans on Mars isn't just about survival or exploration or technological achievement. It's about the possibility that by reaching for the stars, we might become something among them that we never imagined we could be. And yet, for all the challenges and transformations we've explored, there's something almost inevitable about humanity's expansion to Mars that goes beyond mere survival or technological achievement. It's written into our DNA, this restless urge to explore, to push beyond the horizon, to ask what lies on the other side of the mountain. The same drive that sent our ancestors across oceans, in wooden ships, through Arctic ice, and up the faces of impossible mountains is now pointing us toward that rust-coloured dot in the night sky. But here's what makes the Mars story so much more complex than any previous human migration. We're not just moving to a new continent, or even a new planet. We're potentially creating an entirely new branch of human evolution, one that might split from Earth humanity in ways that are permanent and irreversible. Think about what this means for the concept of human identity itself. For the entire history of our species, no matter how far humans travelled or how different their cultures became, they were all still fundamentally shaped by the same planetary environment. A person born in ancient Egypt and someone born in medieval Japan lived under the same sky, breathed the same atmospheric composition, experienced the same gravitational pull, and dealt with the same basic biological constraints. But Mars-born humans would be different in ways that go to the very core of what shapes human experience. Their circadian rhythms might sync to Mars's 24-hour and 37-minute day rather than Earth's 24-hour cycle. Their spatial reasoning might be fundamentally altered by growing up in low gravity. Their social instincts might be rewired by the absolute necessity of group cooperation for survival. More intriguingly, they might develop cognitive abilities that Earth humans simply don't possess. When your survival depends on understanding complex technological systems from childhood, when you grow up thinking in terms of closed-loop resource cycles and system redundancies, when every decision must be evaluated against its impact on community survival, your brain might develop in ways that produce entirely new forms of intelligence. Mars colonists might become incredibly good at systems thinking, at understanding complex interconnections and long-term consequences. They might develop forms of collective decision-making and group problem-solving that make them far more effective than Earth humans at managing complex challenges. They might even develop enhanced memory capabilities or faster information processing, simply because the cognitive demands of their environment require it. But these advantages might come with costs that we can barely imagine. The constant focus on survival and technical competence might diminish their capacity for the kind of abstract thinking, artistic expression, and emotional exploration that we consider essential to human nature. They might become incredibly efficient at staying alive but lose something ineffable about what makes life worth living. Or they might go in exactly the opposite direction. Freed from many of Earth's constraints and limitations, living in an environment where human creativity and ingenuity are literally the difference between life and death, they might develop forms of artistic expression and philosophical thinking that surpass anything we've achieved on Earth. When your entire world is a human creation, when every breath of air and drop of water exists because someone designed and built the systems that create it, you might develop an appreciation for human creativity and technological beauty that Earth humans, surrounded by natural wonders, never quite achieve. The Mars colonists might become the ultimate makers, the ultimate engineers of reality itself. Their art might involve designing new atmospheric compositions or creating living ecosystems in underground caverns. Their music might incorporate the sounds of perfectly tuned life support systems or the harmonic frequencies of optimal air recycling. Their literature might explore themes of creation, responsibility, and the relationship between consciousness and environment that Earth humans have never needed to consider. And then there's the question of what happens when these two branches of humanity encounter each other again. If Mars colonists do develop fundamentally different capabilities, values, and ways of thinking, their relationship with Earth might become incredibly complex. They might view Earth humans as quaint but limited, stuck in primitive thinking patterns shaped by an environment that no longer challenges human potential. Earth humans might see Mars colonists as coldly technical, having lost touch with essential human qualities like spontaneity, connection to nature, and emotional depth. These differences could lead to conflict, but they might also lead to an incredibly productive partnership. Earth might provide the creativity, diversity, and emotional richness that Mars colonies need to remain recognizably human. Mars might provide the technical expertise, long-term thinking, and systems management capabilities that Earth needs to address its own environmental and social challenges. The exchange between Earth and Mars could become the driving force behind the next phase of human development, with each world contributing its unique strengths to solve problems that neither could address alone. Earth's artistic and cultural traditions could help Mars colonists maintain their connection to human heritage. Mars's technological innovations and survival strategies could help Earth create more sustainable and resilient civilizations. But this partnership would only work if both branches of humanity remain committed to seeing each other as part of the same species, part of the same story. The risk is that the differences between Earth and Mars humans could become so pronounced that they start to see each other as separate species with separate interests and separate destinies. The communication delays between the planets would make this separation almost inevitable over time. When it takes up to 44 minutes to have a conversation with someone, when news from the other world is always hours or days old, when the daily experiences and challenges of the two populations have almost nothing in common, maintaining a sense of shared identity becomes incredibly difficult. Mars colonists might eventually stop thinking of themselves as humans who happen to live on Mars and start thinking of themselves as Martians who happen to be descended from humans. They might develop their own languages, their own cultural references, their own understanding of what constitutes normal human behaviour and social organisation. This cultural divergence might be accelerated by the unique selection pressures that would shape Mars populations. The people who successfully adapt to life on Mars wouldn't be a random sample of Earth humanity. They'd be individuals with specific personality traits, cognitive abilities, and social skills that make them particularly suited to the challenges of alien world survival. These selection pressures might be so strong that within just a few generations, Mars populations could become statistically different from Earth populations in measurable psychological and cognitive traits. They might be more technically oriented, more comfortable with risk, more focused on long-term planning, and more capable of functioning in small, highly interdependent groups. Over time, these differences could compound, creating feedback loops that make Mars and Earth populations increasingly distinct. Mars colonists who are good at technical problem-solving and group cooperation would be more likely to survive and reproduce, passing these traits on to their children. Meanwhile, Earth humans would continue to be shaped by the selection pressures of their own environment, which reward different combinations of traits and abilities. The result could be the emergence of two genuinely different subspecies of humanity, each adapted to their own world, but potentially incompatible with the other. Mars humans might find Earth's gravity, atmosphere, and social chaos overwhelming and dangerous. Earth humans might find Mars's controlled environment, technical focus, and group-oriented culture stifling and dehumanizing. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Mars might not be the end of human expansion, but just the beginning. Once we've proven that humans can survive and thrive on one alien world, the entire solar system opens up as potential habitat for human civilization. The technologies and social systems developed for Mars could be adapted for colonies on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, on asteroids, or even on Venus after terraforming. Each new world would present its own unique challenges and would likely produce its own distinct branch of human development. The low gravity and thick atmosphere of Titan might produce humans who are tall and graceful, adapted to flying through dense air. The asteroid colonies might develop humans who are comfortable with three-dimensional movement and have enhanced spatial reasoning. The underground colonies on Europa might produce humans who are adapted to high-pressure environments and have enhanced sensory capabilities for navigating in darkness. Over thousands of years, humanity could spread throughout the solar system and beyond, with each world shaping its inhabitants in different ways. We could end up with dozens of different human subspecies, each adapted to their own environment, but all sharing a common heritage and a common commitment to the expansion of consciousness throughout the universe. This vision of humanity's future raises profound questions about what it means to be human and whether maintaining a single human identity is even desirable or possible once we become a multi-world species. Maybe the goal isn't to preserve unchanged human nature across multiple worlds, but to allow human nature to express itself in new ways that we can't even imagine from our current earthbound perspective. Maybe the ultimate gift that Mars could give to humanity isn't just a backup location for our civilization, but the opportunity to discover what we're really capable of becoming when we're not limited by the constraints of a single world. Maybe the challenges of Mars aren't obstacles to overcome, but invitations to evolve into something better than what we currently are. The people who first set foot on Mars won't just be exploring a new world. They'll be taking the first steps in humanity's transformation from a planetary species to a galactic one. They'll be the pioneers not just of space exploration, but of human evolution itself. And maybe that's the most important thing to understand about the prospect of humans living on Mars. It's not really about Mars at all. It's about us, about what we might become, about the incredible journey of consciousness that started in the trees of Africa millions of years ago and might end among the stars. The red planet isn't just our potential second home. It's our invitation to become something more than we ever imagined we could be. And that invitation, whether we accept it or not, has already begun to change us in ways we're only beginning to understand. The question isn't really whether humans will live on Mars. The question is what kind of humans we'll become in the process of getting there, and whether those future humans will still recognize the dreamers who first looked up at that distant red dot and wondered what it would be like to call it home. But even as we peer into this possible future, we can't ignore the fact that the dream of Mars is already changing us here on Earth. The technologies we're developing for Mars colonization are revolutionizing everything from energy storage to food production to environmental management. The questions we're asking about survival on Mars are forcing us to think more carefully about sustainability on Earth. The same closed-loop life support systems that would be essential on Mars could help us create more efficient and less wasteful cities on Earth. The renewable energy technologies designed for Mars could accelerate our transition away from fossil fuels. The psychological and social research needed to understand how humans function in isolated, high-stress environments could help us design better workplaces, schools, and communities. In a very real sense, the journey to Mars has already begun, not in rocket ships and landing pods, but in laboratories and research facilities where scientists and engineers are reimagining what human civilization could look like if we took seriously the challenges of living sustainably in a closed system with limited resources. The Mars project is forcing us to confront questions about human nature, social organization, and our relationship with technology that we might never have asked if we were content to remain forever bound to Earth. And those questions, regardless of whether we ever actually send humans to Mars, are already beginning to reshape how we think about our future on this planet. Because at its heart, the dream of Mars isn't really about escaping from Earth or finding a backup planet for human civilization. It's about pushing the boundaries of what's possible, about refusing to accept the limitations that currently define human existence, about believing that we can become something more than we currently are. And that belief, that restless human urge to explore and expand and evolve, might be the most important thing we could carry with us to Mars. Not our technology, not our knowledge, not our cultural achievements, but our fundamental conviction that no frontier is too distant, no challenge too difficult, no dream too ambitious for the species that learned to control fire, developed language, built cities, and sent messages across the void to robots exploring alien worlds. The humans who eventually make Mars their home will carry with them not just the tools and knowledge needed for survival, but the entire history of human curiosity and creativity that brought us to that point. They'll be the latest chapter in the longest story ever told, the story of consciousness awakening to itself and reaching out to touch the cosmos. And whether that story ends with humans thriving among the stars or learning to build paradise on the only world we've ever known, the very fact that we're capable of imagining such possibilities might be the most remarkable thing about our species. The red planet waits in the darkness, silent and patient, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply there. What we make of that opportunity, what we become in the process of reaching for it, and what we discover about ourselves along the way might be the most important adventure humanity has ever undertaken. And it all begins with a simple question that we're still learning how to answer. What if humans lived on Mars? The answer, whatever it turns out to be, will tell us as much about who we are as it does about where we're going. The story becomes even more fascinating when we consider that Mars colonists wouldn't just be surviving on an alien world, they'd be creating the first truly post-Earth human culture. Every tradition, every social custom, every way of organizing daily life would need to be reinvented from scratch in an environment where the basic assumptions that shaped all previous human societies simply don't apply. Think about something as fundamental as the concept of seasons. On Earth, human cultures across the globe have organized their calendars, festivals, agriculture, and social rhythms around the predictable cycle of seasonal change. Spring means renewal and planting, summer means growth and abundance, autumn means harvest and preparation, winter means rest and reflection. These patterns are so deeply embedded in human psychology that they show up in our literature, our religions, our music, and even our economic systems. But Mars has seasons that last twice as long as Earth's, and they're nothing like what we're used to. A Martian winter isn't about snow and cozy fires and holiday gatherings. It's about dust storms that can cover the entire planet for months at a time, blocking out the sun and forcing everyone to live on stored energy and recycled air. A Martian summer isn't about beach vacations and outdoor festivals. It's about slightly less lethal radiation exposure and marginally warmer temperatures that are still cold enough to freeze your blood. Mars colonists would need to develop entirely new cultural rhythms, new ways of marking time and meaning that have nothing to do with the natural cycles that shaped every previous human civilization. They might organise their social calendar around the maintenance schedules of their life support systems, or the arrival of supply ships from Earth, or the optimal times for surface expeditions when radiation levels are at their lowest. Their festivals and celebrations might revolve around technological achievements rather than natural phenomena. Imagine holidays celebrating the anniversary of the first successful atmospheric processor, or coming-of-age ceremonies that involve mastering the complex protocols for emergency EVA suits. Their creation myths might focus not on gods shaping the natural world, but on the human engineers and scientists who built the artificial world that keeps them alive. The concept of privacy, which we take for granted on Earth, would be almost meaningless in early Mars colonies. When you're living in pressurized habitats, where every cubic foot of space has been carefully designed for maximum efficiency, where walls are thin because every extra pound of building material had to be shipped from another planet, where life support systems need constant monitoring and maintenance, the idea of having a private space where you can be completely alone becomes a luxury that might literally be impossible to afford. Mars colonists would need to develop new social protocols for managing interpersonal relationships in environments where you can never really get away from the people around you. They might develop sophisticated systems of social etiquette that allow for emotional space. Even when physical space is limited, they might create cultural practices that provide psychological privacy even when actual privacy is impossible. The role of children in Mars society would be unlike anything we've seen in human history. On Earth, children are often seen as the future of society, but they're also viewed as dependents who need to be protected and gradually educated about the world around them. On Mars, children would be both incredibly precious and incredibly vulnerable. Every child born on Mars would represent a massive investment of resources and a critical component of the colony's long-term survival. But they'd also be living in an environment where a single mistake or moment of carelessness could be fatal. Mars children would need to learn technical skills and safety protocols that would challenge adult professionals on Earth. They'd need to understand atmospheric pressure and radiation exposure and emergency procedures before they learn to read. They'd need to develop an intuitive understanding of complex technological systems that their survival depends on, while somehow maintaining the curiosity and creativity that makes childhood valuable in the first place. The educational systems that emerge on Mars would be unlike anything we've developed on Earth. There would be no room for purely theoretical education or abstract knowledge that doesn't have direct practical applications. Every subject would need to tie back to the fundamental challenge of staying alive in an environment that wants to kill you. Mathematics would be taught through life support calculations. Physics would be learned through understanding how habitats maintain pressure and temperature. Biology would focus on the closed-loop systems that recycle air and water and waste. But this intensely practical focus might also produce humans with a deeper understanding of how complex systems work than any Earth-based education has ever achieved. Mars children might grow up with an intuitive grasp of engineering, environmental science, and systems thinking that would make them incredibly capable problem solvers and innovators. The relationship between work and identity would be fundamentally different on Mars. On Earth, many people struggle to find meaningful work, or they work in jobs that feel disconnected from their personal values or the broader needs of society. But on Mars, almost every job would be literally a matter of life and death for the community. The person who maintains the oxygen recyclers isn't just doing a technical job, they're keeping everyone alive. The person who manages food production isn't just farming, they're preventing starvation. The person who monitors radiation levels isn't just collecting data, they're protecting the genetic future of the colony. This direct connection between individual work and community survival might create a sense of purpose and meaning that many Earth workers never experience, but it might also create enormous psychological pressure and stress. When your job performance could literally determine whether your friends and family live or die, the stakes for professional competence become almost unbearable. Mars colonists might develop new approaches to managing work-related stress and responsibility that focus on collective support and shared accountability rather than individual performance pressure. They might create cultural practices that help people cope with the enormous responsibility of keeping a community alive while maintaining their psychological health and personal relationships. The economic systems that emerge on Mars would challenge fundamental assumptions about scarcity, ownership, and individual economic freedom that have shaped human societies for thousands of years. On Earth, even in the most controlled economies, there's usually some concept of personal property and individual economic choice. You might not be able to afford everything you want, but you generally have some discretion about how to spend your resources and what priorities to set for your personal consumption. But on Mars, resource allocation would need to be managed with a precision and efficiency that leaves little room for individual economic preferences. When every calorie of food represents a significant investment in growing systems and energy, when every litre of water requires complex processing and recycling, when every breath of air needs to be carefully produced and maintained, the luxury of economic choice becomes a threat to community survival. Mars colonies might develop economic systems that look more like sophisticated resource management algorithms than traditional markets. Personal consumption might be determined by complex calculations that balance individual needs, community priorities, and long-term sustainability goals. People might earn increased resource allocations through exceptional contributions to community survival, but the basic concept of accumulating wealth for personal consumption might become meaningless or even dangerous. This doesn't necessarily mean that Mars colonies would be joyless or oppressive. They might develop entirely new concepts of wealth and status that focus on contribution to community well-being rather than personal accumulation. Social status might come from mastering critical skills, solving important problems, or helping others adapt to the challenges of Mars life, rather than from owning expensive possessions or controlling economic resources. The environmental relationship that Mars colonists develop would be unlike anything any human society has ever experienced. Every previous human culture has been shaped by interaction with natural environments that existed independently of human control. Even the most urban Earth dwellers live in cities that are built around natural features, like rivers and harbours, under skies that change according to weather patterns they can't control, breathing air that's cleaned by forests and oceans they didn't create. But Mars colonists would live in environments that are entirely artificial, created and maintained by human technology and human decisions. Their nature would be the carefully controlled atmospheric processes, the precisely managed growing chambers, the efficiently recycled waste systems that keep them alive. They might develop a sense of environmental stewardship that's focused not on preserving existing natural systems, but on maintaining and improving the artificial systems that support life. This could lead to environmental philosophies that see human technology not as separate from or opposed to nature, but as the highest expression of natural intelligence and creativity. Mars colonists might view themselves as partners with the universe in the ongoing project of creating conditions suitable for life and consciousness. Alternatively, they might develop a profound longing for the natural world they've never experienced, creating elaborate artificial recreations of Earth environments or developing spiritual practices focused on the distant blue dot that represents everything their species left behind. Their art and literature might be dominated by themes of loss and exile, focused on imagining what it would be like to walk in a forest or swim in an ocean or feel rain on their skin. The healthcare systems that emerge on Mars would need to be far more sophisticated and comprehensive than anything we've developed on Earth, despite having access to far fewer resources and specialists. Mars colonists couldn't rely on emergency evacuation to specialized medical centers or consultation with experts around the world. They'd need to be prepared to handle everything from routine medical care to complex surgical procedures to psychological crises with whatever resources and expertise they have available locally. This would likely lead to medical training becoming a basic life skill that most colonists would need to master to some degree. Everyone might need to understand basic emergency medicine, just as everyone would need to understand basic life support maintenance. The colony's medical officers would need to be incredibly versatile, capable of handling everything from routine checkups to major trauma to psychiatric emergencies. But the medical challenges on Mars would go far beyond just having limited resources. The colonists would be dealing with health problems that have never existed before in human history. The effects of long-term low-gravity exposure, constant artificial atmosphere, limited genetic diversity, and chronic radiation exposure would create medical challenges that no Earth-based training could fully prepare them for. Mars colonists might need to become pioneers in medical research and treatment, developing new approaches to healthcare that are specifically adapted to their unique environment. They might discover medical treatments and preventive strategies that prove valuable for Earth medicine as well, particularly in areas like radiation therapy, bone density management, and psychological care for people living in extreme environments. The cultural and artistic expressions that emerge on Mars would reflect the unique challenges and opportunities of their environment in ways that would be both fascinating and potentially disturbing to Earth audiences. When your entire world is artificial, when every aspect of your environment has been deliberately designed and constructed, when the line between technology and nature has been completely erased, what kind of art do you create? Mars artists might develop forms of expression that focus on the beauty of perfectly functioning technological systems, the aesthetics of efficient resource utilization, the emotional resonance of life support equipment, humming in perfect harmony. Their music might incorporate the sounds of atmospheric processors and recycling systems. Their visual art might celebrate the elegant curves of habitat modules and the precise geometry of solar panel arrays. Or they might go in the opposite direction, creating art that imagines impossible organic worlds, that dreams of environments where things grow wild and uncontrolled, where water flows without pumps and air moves without fans. Their literature might be dominated by fantasies of Earth-like environments that they've never experienced, but somehow remember in their genetic memory. The philosophical and spiritual systems that develop on Mars would grapple with questions that no human religion or philosophy has ever needed to address. What does it mean to be human when your entire environment is artificial? What is the relationship between consciousness and the cosmos when you're living in a bubble of human-created atmosphere surrounded by a universe that's actively hostile to life? How do you find meaning and purpose when your existence depends entirely on machines and systems that could fail at any moment? Mars colonists might develop spiritual practices that focus on the sacred responsibility of maintaining life in an environment that naturally tends toward death. They might see their technological systems not as mere tools, but as holy instruments that allow consciousness to persist in places where it would naturally be impossible. They might develop philosophies that see the expansion of life and consciousness throughout the universe as a sacred mission, viewing themselves as the universe's way of becoming aware of itself and deliberately shaping its own evolution. Or they might develop more pessimistic worldviews that focus on the fundamental isolation and vulnerability of consciousness in a hostile cosmos. The communication technologies and social media systems that emerge on Mars would need to address the unique challenges of maintaining social connections across vast distances and time delays. The communication delay between Mars and Earth would make real-time social interaction impossible, forcing Mars colonists to develop new forms of asynchronous social connection that could maintain emotional intimacy despite temporal separation. They might develop sophisticated virtual reality systems that allow them to share experiences with friends and family on Earth, creating artificial environments where they can spend time together despite being separated by millions of miles and dozens of minutes of communication delay. They might create new forms of artistic expression that are specifically designed to be transmitted across interplanetary distances, optimized for the constraints of limited bandwidth and extended transmission times. The legal and governance systems that emerge in Mars colonies would need to balance individual rights and freedoms with the absolute necessity of community survival in ways that no Earth legal system has ever attempted. Traditional concepts of individual liberty assume that people can make personal choices without directly threatening the survival of others. But on Mars, almost every personal decision would have potential impacts on community welfare. Mars colonies might develop legal systems that focus more on restorative justice and community rehabilitation than on punishment and individual rights. When you can't afford to lose anyone from the community, when everyone's skills and knowledge are essential for survival, the goal of the legal system becomes keeping people functional and integrated rather than punishing them for violations of social norms. The democratic ideals that many Earth societies value might need to be balanced against the reality that some decisions on Mars are simply too technical and too critical to be made by popular vote. You can't democratically decide to ignore the laws of physics or vote to make the life support systems work differently than they actually do. This could lead to forms of technocratic governance, where technical expertise carries more weight in decision-making than popular opinion. But Mars colonies might also develop new forms of participatory decision-making that involve the entire community in technical discussions and resource allocation decisions in ways that are more genuinely democratic than most Earth governments manage to achieve. When everyone's survival depends on community decisions, everyone has a strong incentive to become informed about the technical and social challenges facing the colony. The transportation systems that develop on Mars would be unlike anything we've built on Earth. Every vehicle would need to be a miniature life support system, capable of keeping passengers alive in a vacuum while transporting them across terrain that could kill them if they made a single mistake. Mars rovers wouldn't just be cars, they'd be mobile habitats with backup power systems, emergency oxygen supplies, radiation shielding, and communication equipment that could call for rescue if something went wrong. The distances between Mars settlements might be so vast that travel between them would require careful planning and preparation similar to space missions on Earth. A trip from one Mars city to another might take days or weeks of travel through completely hostile terrain, with no possibility of rescue if something went wrong along the way. This could lead to Mars settlements becoming quite isolated from each other, developing their own distinct cultures and approaches to survival that reflect their specific local challenges and resources. Over time, different Mars settlements might become as culturally distinct as different countries on Earth, despite sharing the common challenge of survival on an alien world. The agricultural systems that emerge on Mars would represent one of the most sophisticated examples of controlled environment agriculture ever attempted. Every plant grown on Mars would need to be cultivated in carefully managed artificial environments with precisely controlled lighting, temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition. There would be no natural soil, no rain, no seasonal cycles, no insects for pollination, no natural pest control. Mars farmers would need to be part botanist, part engineer, part chemist, and part computer programmer. They'd need to understand not just how plants grow, but how to design and maintain the complex technological systems that create the conditions for plant growth. They'd need to develop new varieties of crops that are optimized for artificial growing conditions and the specific nutritional needs of people living in high-stress survival situations. The food that emerges from these systems might be more nutritious and efficiently produced than anything we've achieved on Earth, but it might also be bland and monotonous compared to the incredible diversity of flavors and textures that Earth agriculture provides. Mars colonists might develop sophisticated food preparation techniques that create variety and enjoyment from limited ingredients, or they might simply adapt to a more utilitarian relationship with food that focuses on nutrition and efficiency rather than pleasure and cultural expression. The waste management systems on Mars would be marvels of efficiency and recycling that put Earth's best environmental practices to shame. Nothing could be thrown away or wasted because there's nowhere for waste to go and no natural systems to break it down and recycle it. Every scrap of organic matter would need to be composted and returned to the growing systems. Every drop of water would need to be purified and recycled. Every breath of air would need to be scrubbed clean and reused. Mars colonists would develop an understanding of closed-loop systems and resource cycling that would make them incredibly efficient and environmentally conscious by Earth standards. They might become experts at designing systems that produce zero waste and maximum efficiency, knowledge that could be incredibly valuable for addressing Earth's environmental challenges. But this level of efficiency and control might also create psychological stress and a sense of being trapped in artificial systems with no escape or relief. The knowledge that every waste product you create needs to be processed and recycled, that every resource you consume takes away from someone else's allocation, that every inefficiency in your personal habits could threaten community survival, might create a level of environmental anxiety that Earth humans have never experienced. The research and development that takes place on Mars would be driven by immediate survival needs in ways that could accelerate innovation far beyond what's possible in Earth's more comfortable, academic, and corporate research environments. When your life depends on solving technical problems, when every improvement in efficiency or reliability could mean the difference between survival and death for your community, the motivation for innovation becomes incredibly intense. Mars colonies might become hotbeds of technological development, producing advances in life support technology, resource management, closed-loop systems, radiation shielding, low-gravity medicine, and dozens of other fields that would benefit both Mars and Earth. The pressure to innovate and improve would be constant and urgent in ways that Earth research rarely experiences. But this focus on immediate practical needs might also limit the kind of basic research and abstract thinking that drives long-term scientific progress. When every research project needs to have direct applications for survival, there might be little room for the kind of curiosity-driven investigation that leads to unexpected breakthroughs and paradigm shifts. Mars colonies might become incredibly good at solving known problems and improving existing technologies, but they might struggle to make the kind of fundamental discoveries that reshape our understanding of the universe. They might need to maintain close connections with Earth research institutions to ensure that the broader project of human knowledge continues to advance, even as they focus on the immediate challenges of staying alive. The timeline for all of these cultural, social, and technological developments would be measured in generations rather than years or decades. The first Mars colonists would be focused almost entirely on basic survival, establishing the fundamental infrastructure and systems needed to keep humans alive on an alien world. Their children might begin to develop the first distinctly Martian cultural practices and social institutions. Their grandchildren might start to think of Mars as home rather than exile, but the full flowering of a genuinely independent Martian civilization might take centuries or millennia to emerge. The process would be gradual and often imperceptible to the people living through it, like the slow drift of continental plates or the evolution of languages over time. Each generation would adapt a little more to their environment, develop slightly different ways of thinking and behaving, create new traditions, and abandon old ones that no longer make sense in their context. The result would be a gradual divergence between Mars and Earth human cultures that might eventually become so pronounced that the two populations would have difficulty understanding each other, not just culturally, but potentially even linguistically and cognitively. Mars humans might develop ways of thinking and communicating that are optimized for their technical, survival-focused environment, while Earth humans continue to be shaped by the vastly different pressures and opportunities of life on their home planet. This cultural divergence would be accelerated by the simple fact that most Mars colonists would never visit Earth, and most Earth humans would never visit Mars. The expense and danger of interplanetary travel would mean that the two populations would have little direct contact, learning about each other primarily through communications that are delayed by the speed of light and filtered through the inevitable distortions of long-distance transmission. Over time, Mars and Earth might develop into genuinely separate branches of human civilization, each adapted to their own world, but sharing a common heritage and a common commitment to the expansion of consciousness throughout the universe. They might maintain peaceful and productive relationships while becoming as culturally distinct as ancient China and medieval Europe, or as modern Japan and Brazil. The ultimate question facing any permanent Mars colony would be whether they're preserving human civilization or transforming it into something entirely new. The environmental pressures, social structures, economic systems, and cultural adaptations required for life on Mars are so different from anything humans have experienced that the people who thrive there might be recognizably human in their DNA, but alien in almost every other way. And this transformation wouldn't necessarily be gradual or subtle. The selection pressures for survival on Mars are so intense that significant changes could emerge within just a few generations. The humans who successfully adapt to permanent life on Mars might be as different from us as we are from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, not because of genetic evolution, but because of the complete transformation of their environment, culture, and daily experience. Whether this transformation represents the fulfillment of human potential or the loss of essential human qualities might be impossible to determine until long after it's already happened. And by then, the beings making that judgment might be so different from us that their conclusions would be incomprehensible to the humans who first dreamed of making Mars our home. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps the greatest gift that Mars could give to humanity isn't just a backup location for our civilization, but the opportunity to discover what we're really capable of becoming when we're not limited by the constraints of a single world. Perhaps the challenges of Mars aren't obstacles to overcome, but invitations to evolve into something better, more capable, more conscious than what we currently are. The red planet waits in the darkness, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply there. What we make of that opportunity, what we become in the process of reaching for it, and what we discover about ourselves along the way might be the most important adventure humanity has ever undertaken. And it's an adventure that's already begun, not in rocket ships and landing pods, but in the laboratories and research facilities where we're learning what it really means to be human in a universe that's vast, dangerous, and full of possibilities we're only beginning to imagine.